When you think of Apple computers, what do you think of? What concepts and ideas come to your head? What about Google? Both of these companies are considered to have well-recognized international brands. A brand is much more than just a product or a logo. A brand is an idea that distinguishes one product or service from others. Both Apple and Google brands tend to elicit a common idea. People recognize the logos right away, and the company names themselves seem to bring to mind the concept innovation. The companies recognize this and do all they can to reinforce that connection in consumers' minds, because it helps convince those consumers to buy the next great product coming down the pipe. Think of all the buzz that a new iPhone release generates, and even the iPad generated when it first came out. Even with all the jokes about the iPad name, it was talked about incessantly in the media, and people lined up to buy. That was more than just good product design. It was Apple's brand at work. While many people are familiar with the idea of company brands, it's less often discussed that people can have brands as well. Some people, because of careful attention to the impressions they make on others, have developed a positive image that can work to their advantage time and time again. When we discuss brands in this way, they're not really distinct from the idea of reputation or image. What's useful to understand is that the techniques that companies use to build their brands can also be applied to individuals. With a little foresight and planning and some discipline in words and action, you can work to create a personal brand that will help you accomplish your personal and professional goals. You might think about it this way. Your capacity to influence others begins long before you actually attempt to influence a particular person in a particular setting. It begins with what you do to establish a reputation that allows you to be perceived positively. That positive image will foster liking and trust, which, as we've already discussed, are helpful characteristics of an agent trying to influence a target. In the United States, we often discuss Michael Jordan as a classic example of a strong personal brand that's helped a former basketball champion forge a fantastic business career. Oprah Winfrey is no different, nor is Donald Trump, although for some people that brand is not as positive as Oprah's. Let's talk about an example that's less well known in the United States. Let's discuss one of the best brand names in the most populous country in the entire world. In China, the name Li Ning is synonymous with athletic excellence. How did Ning develop this brand? To begin, he was a winner. In the 1982 World Cup gymnastic competition, he won 6 of the 7 medals awarded for men. Then, in the 1984 Summer Olympics held in Los Angeles, he won 3 gold medals, 2 silvers, and a bronze. This was the first Summer Olympics since 1952 in which the People's Republic of China participated, and he immediately became the most decorated Olympic athlete in Chinese history. He went on to win an astounding 14 world titles in gymnastics. Everything about his accomplishments demonstrates that he is a highly capable athlete. But in addition, Ning looks like a nice, warm, genuine person. If you look at a picture of Ning, you can immediately see that he has that kind of appeal of someone you would like to know and meet. Because of his image as an outstanding athlete and a nice person, and certainly to some extent his timing, Ning became more than just an athlete. He became a symbol of a growing, confident nation. When he retired from gymnastics in 1989, he did something that was quite unusual at the time in China. He leveraged his name and reputation to start his own high-profile sporting goods company, Li Ning Company. It has excelled, opening thousands of stores in China. Indeed, after Ning's high-profile torch lighting in the opening ceremony of the 2008 Beijing Olympics, the company began opening stores around the world. Ning used the association of his name, his brand, of athletic excellence to bring people into stores to buy shoes and sporting apparel. That is the power of a brand, and it speaks to the influence that positive impressions can make on others. Now, not all of us can be world-class athletes, but Ning's success brings us to the broad question of how people lay the groundwork for future influence attempts by making good impressions and building a good reputation. If opening a retail store named after yourself was so unusual in China, how was Ning able to convince people that it was a good idea? Research has addressed this question, and we will explore those studies in this lecture. Up to this point in the course, we've been talking about the general processes that underlie successful influence, the components of ATTIC. From this point forward, we're going to shift our focus a bit. We're going to move from general processes to specific applications of influence. In this lecture, we'll talk about active efforts to manage impressions, a topic that comes up quite a bit in business contexts. So let's start the last section of our course with the topic of impression management. How could we shape the perception others have of us so we're more likely to be successful at influencing them in the future? Li Ning has had great success convincing others to buy his athletic apparel. What practical lessons can we learn from this success? And can we apply those lessons when we're on the job or interviewing to get a new job? Impression management refers to tactics that people use to establish a particular impression of themselves. There's some overlap here, obviously, with influence, but the nature of the influence techniques here are a little distinct. With impression management, you're generally trying to influence someone into believing you're a good person, or in the context of a job interview, a good potential employee. That is, you are trying to create a good impression that you can use or work to your advantage later on. There are quite a few lists of impression management tactics, but let's start at the broadest level. Most generally, impression management tactics can be self-focused or other-focused. We'll refer to self-focused tactics as self-promotion, which essentially involves saying, hey, I'm good. Other-focused tactics we'll call ingratiation. Ingratiation involves telling someone else, hey, you're good. These two broad approaches have been studied in contexts where evaluations matter a great deal, interview contexts especially, but also in ongoing job contexts. In our very first lecture, we looked at a study conducted by Tim Judge and Bob Bretz. These two scholars asked graduates from two large universities, one on the East Coast and one in the Midwest, to complete a survey about how they generally influence others at work and about their career outcomes, including salary and number of promotions. Controlling for other potential causes of career success, the researchers found that those who focused on job performance actually had lower salaries and fewer promotions than those who focused on their supervisor. So perhaps the greatest lesson from this particular study is that it's better to make your boss feel good than to make yourself look good, at least when it comes to getting that next promotion. Impression management is particularly important when you are looking for a job. One of the most common hurdles that we all have to jump over is the employment interview. You have to meet someone, shake their hand, answer a few questions, and have that person walk away saying, wow, that's someone we should hire. How do you convince that interviewer sitting across the table that you would be a good hire? Here we have to rely on some other research studies. Research suggests that the handshake at the beginning of an interview can make a big difference. Most business people in the United States agree that a good handshake involves a firm, complete grip, eye contact, and vigorous up and down movement. How could you design a study to test whether a handshake matters? Well, in one University of Iowa study, Professors Greg Stewart and his colleagues and graduate students examined the handshakes of nearly 100 undergraduate students. And they looked at whether it helped them make a good impression and be recommended for a job. Here's how they did the study. Stewart and his colleagues offered a free mock interview service for students. Students signed up in advance, were told to come to a designated room, and then when they arrived, they were greeted by a trained research assistant who conducted some introductions and, of course, shook hands. Each participant was then introduced to a few more research assistants as he or she was led to the room where a professional recruiter was waiting. By the end of the session, no fewer than 5 research assistants had shook the hand of the participant. After each greeting, the assistant would excuse him or herself, go into another room, and rate the handshake on the dimensions of firmness of grip, completeness of grip, eye contact, and vigorous up and down movement. Now, as it turns out, these dimensions tend to correlate highly. So handshakes offered by participants generally range from overall poor to overall excellent. Just as importantly, the ratings by the 5 assistants were highly correlated. So we have a good indication that there is a reliable measure for each person of handshake ability. It's important to note that the professional recruiter who conducted the interviews was never asked about handshakes and was only asked to use the same interview format they used with their job and then, at the end, provide a hiring recommendation. Of course, these interviews always began and ended with a handshake. After each interview, the professional recruiters rated the participant on his or her hireability. Basically, they answered the question, how strongly would you recommend this person to be hired? Guess what related highly to that rating? The handshake ability index. In fact, the quality of the handshake mattered more than any other variable that they collected and analyzed. Clearly, recruiters and potential bosses are taking something away from that first handshake. But what characteristics can be ascertained from a simple handshake? I can offer my own speculation here. A good handshake likely conveys 2 things about a person that are very important. First, I'm a competent professional, confident and strong. And second, I like you. I'm looking you in the eye and I'm genuinely pleased to meet you. If this is indeed what a good handshake conveys, then it fits quite well with other research on person perception. For example, Susan Fisk, professor of psychology at Princeton University, has worked with a series of colleagues to reveal that people generally pick up on 2 cues when they first meet someone: competence and warmth. To make this easier to remember, I'll use the terms competent and caring. Competent refers to the ability to get things done. Caring refers to being seen as helpful and warm. Think back to our example of Li Ning, as well as to those University of Iowa students who were out there shaking hands. The signal being sent is a strong one that likely connects with people at a very primitive, subconscious level. I am the kind of person who can get things done, and I can help you because I care about you. These are the types of people we like and will trust, and as a result, we're primed and ready to be influenced by them, including buying their products or offering them jobs. Obviously, a successful interview involves more than just a strong handshake. And impression management tactics in the interview context have been analyzed in other scholarly studies. For example, a 2002 study by Alex Ellis goes into a bit more detail about the importance of self-promotion and ingratiation in successful job interviews. For starters, Ellis breaks these 2 large categories into various specific tactics. For example, he breaks ingratiation into 2 specific tactics: opinion conformity and other enhancement. Opinion conformity refers to stating beliefs that one could reasonably assume the other person would also hold. Other enhancement is more straightforward flattery, saying something positive about that person. In addition, Ellis's study identifies a third broad category of impression management tactics called defensive tactics. Defensive tactics include excuses, justifications, and even apologies as ways to protect or repair reputation. Here's how the study worked. The researchers obtained audio tapes of practice interviews conducted by real employers. The interviews were conducted by different recruiters, but all involved the same 14 questions. 119 structured interview audio tapes were coded by 2 trained research assistants who listened carefully for the use of those tactics. What were the commonly used tactics and which worked best? Well, first, it's worth noting that all but 3 of this entire sample of interviewees used at least one of the impression management tactics: self-promotion, ingratiation, and defensive tactics. People were actively trying to manage impressions while answering interview questions. But which of those tactics worked? Both self-promotion and ingratiation tactics had a small, positive, and statistically significant correlation with interview evaluations. So using these tactics was associated with higher evaluations by the interviewer. Defensive tactics, on the other hand, had a much lower correlation that wasn't significant. Taken as a whole, this study suggests that in formal interview contexts, engaging in both self-promotion and a bit of opinion conformity is likely to create the most positive impression. Interview situations are quite unique in that someone is actively making a judgment about you. What happens when people are in a more natural situation, such as working in a group to complete a project? Do people use impression management tactics in these situations? Do they use them in any particular combination? We might expect to see different combinations of tactics emerge in those types of real-world settings. And in fact, this is exactly what Mark Bellino and William Chernley found in 2 studies they conducted. In their first study, Bellino and Chernley took 86 college students who'd been working on an intense course project, working in small teams all semester. They had the students rate their own impression management tactic use. They had each person note their use of ingratiation, seeking to be likable by flattering or doing favors; self-promotion, seeking to be viewed as competent by touting abilities and accomplishments; exemplification, seeking to be viewed as dedicated by going above and beyond the call of duty; supplication, seeking to be viewed as needy by showing weakness or broadcasting limitations; and finally, intimidation, seeking to be viewed as intimidating by threatening or bullying others. People tended to cluster into 3 profiles with regard to their use of impression management tactics. Positives generally made use of ingratiation, self-promotion, and exemplification, trying to create an overall positive image of themselves. Passives generally made little use of any tactic. And then there were aggressives. Aggressives tend to use all of the tactics, both positive and negative. That means that relative to positives and passives, they're the ones who make greater use of intimidation. Of course, these patterns don't necessarily tell us whether one profile is better than the other. To address that question, Bellino and Chernley conducted a second study. This time, they surveyed 173 students working in a similar class, but in a subsequent semester. The researchers had students report their own use of impression management tactics and had their team members rate how desirable they were as a team member. In addition, the researchers had everyone complete personality surveys. You may recall from our lecture on the dark triad that there's a negative personality characteristic called Machiavellianism, which is a tendency to do whatever it takes to get one's way. They measured that characteristic. The results of this second study confirm the pattern of 3 clusters of people: positives, aggressives, and passives. It also found that more women were passives than aggressives, 35% versus 21%. More men were aggressives, 35%, as compared to passives, 11%. In short, men living up to stereotype were more likely to show up in that aggressive category. High Machiavellian people were more likely to be either passive or aggressive. Low Machiavellians were more likely to be positive. This finding reinforces the idea that Machiavellian personality types may actually act differently depending on what they need to accomplish their goals. They'll act aggressive when it's allowed and passive when they think it's required or useful. Among the three profiles, who was perceived as the better team member? Although the researchers hypothesized that positives would always be considered the best team members, both positives and passives were viewed favorably. Aggressives were consistently seen as less effective team members. So if you want to be seen as a good team member, these results provide pretty clear guidance. You should avoid supplication and intimidation and focus on positive impression management tactics. If you want to pave the way for successful influence down the road, then you can either step back and let other things run, being passive, or you can be positive and use self-promotion and ingratiation just as you would in an interview setting. While we've been talking about making a good impression on a team and getting a job, it seems likely that impression management tactics may play out on bigger stages. What happens, for example, when CEOs who are trying to influence the media and shareholders that all is well and now is the time to buy stock? Well, research offers some insight into how ingratiation plays out in that context. Jim Westphal from the University of Michigan has actually studied ingratiation and CEOs. In one study, he examined how they use ingratiation with reporters. And in a second study, he examined how CEOs are affected by others' use of ingratiation on them. In the first study, Westphal and his colleague David Deephouse showed that ingratiation of journalists by CEOs may actually help them get better news coverage for their companies. To show that this occurs, the authors examined relationships between CEOs and journalists using large and mid-sized public companies. The researchers sent surveys to executives at 4 points in time: prior to an earnings announcement, 3 days after that announcement, 7 days after, and 30 days after. Then they surveyed journalists who covered these companies at those same time intervals. Using surveys at different points in time helped the researchers understand whether CEOs were generally consistent in how they used ingratiation or whether they popped up in their use of ingratiation following negative events. And what they found was that CEOs generally use ingratiation following earnings announcements. What the researchers were looking for was how journalists would describe the CEO and the firm when an earnings announcement indicates the company failed to meet forecasts. And what the researchers found was that journalists wrote fewer negative things about firm's leadership and the firm's strategy when the CEO was using ingratiation on that particular journalist. In other words, CEOs who used ingratiation tended to be let off the hook for bad news by a journalist. In addition, those same journalists went on to be more forgiving of poor performance and to say, boy, that's probably the result of the economy rather than of the firm's failure of leadership. So here we see the positive effects of impression management tactics in big business settings, where the use of ingratiation by a CEO can get the company more positive news coverage, something that firms clearly want. From this perspective, CEOs who use ingratiation with journalists are doing their job well. They're using impression management to influence journalists to get good news coverage and to provide cover when there are poor earnings announcements. But ingratiation doesn't just work as a one-way street. In another study, Westphal worked with colleagues Park and Stern to explain how CEOs can be the victim of ingratiation. Specifically, Westphal found that CEOs who get lots of flattery from an immediate team are more likely to sustain a losing strategic direction and keep performance of the company poor over longer or more extended periods of time. This shows that CEOs can fall victim themselves to the impression management tactics employed by the people around them, and the results aren't good for the company or for the CEOs. Westphal's analysis revealed that those CEOs who were surrounded by flatterers, people using ingratiation, were more likely in the end to lose their job. In short, those CEOs sustained a losing course of action because others were there making them feel good, and they lost their job in the end. Generally, though, we've seen that ingratiation is an effective tactic that works when you're trying to get a promotion, secure a job in an interview, or build a better image for your company if you're the CEO. I hasten to add, though, that ingratiation can be done poorly, and it can backfire if it's seen as insincere or a blatant attempt at controlling someone. Imagine poorly delivered attempts at ingratiation. The teenage son saying, "Dad, have you lost some weight? Can I borrow the car?" The new employee to her boss, "You are the best manager I've ever had. Can I have a raise?" In both cases, it's clear that a compliment is being delivered to get something in return. In these cases, the compliment is not perceived as genuine and will not have the desired effect. Ingratiation works best when it's sincere and not directly and immediately connected to a particular request. If you recall the lecture on influence tactics, I discussed how political skill, especially apparent sincerity, can make the difference between success and failure. This operates with impression management as well. Why does ingratiation work? I believe it works if it believably conveys one of the two most important signals that people want to see before they like and trust another person. That the person is caring. Caring, along with competent, as we discussed, are what you want people to think of you if you want to be influential. While there may be some of us out there who can fake those characteristics well, it is a far easier and far better path to be genuinely competent and genuinely caring. In this lecture, we've moved from the attic model to a specific application of influence, tactics used proactively to make a good impression that will lay the groundwork for influence in the future. But I hope you can see the clear connection between the attic model and impression management. For example, time and time again today, we've noted the interaction between the agent and the target. How the agent is perceived by the target is crucial. Is she caring and competent, knowledgeable, admirable? As an agent, you can build a reputation that includes these positive descriptors with careful and sincere use of self-promotion, opinion conformity, and ingratiation. In other words, it's in your power to create a personal brand that helps you become more influential. Let's conclude with two things to try related to impression management. First, keep track of the number of compliments you give over the course of a week. Keep a running tally, and then at the end of each day, write down the total number of compliments. And as you think back over that day, consider how many of those were honest compliments, genuinely meant to share your positive thoughts about others without immediate hope of anything in return. Write a percentage next to the total number of compliments for each day. At the end of the week, revisit those numbers and make a plan for the next week. If you aren't giving at least a few compliments each day, make an effort to be more complimentary. Of course, make sure your compliments are genuine. If your percent of genuineness is low, set a goal to raise it. If you do this, you'll be learning to use ingratiation in a way that will help you build a positive reputation. As a second activity, track the number of self-promotional statements you make over the course of a week. Write down the number of those statements and think back over the day. Consider whether you are over or understating your capabilities. Self-promotion works in many settings, but you can definitely overdo it, which explains why it doesn't always work. If you have more than just a couple of these statements each day, you should begin the next week with the goal of reducing those numbers. Instead of proclaiming your competence, you should be demonstrating it. Well, I hope you're feeling better equipped to make a positive impression in any context you might encounter. Next time, we'll leave the employment interview and the corporate boardroom behind and head over to the local mall, where we'll discuss influence tactics used by effective salespeople.